Hi, Chael. This is Professor Evans with feedback on your SA2, the rhetorical analysis. So as always, let's start with what the criteria was for this. We're looking for an introduction that would engage an audience, a clear thesis that would work as a roadmap as to where you're going in your argument. Clear structure to the paper itself in terms of the order of operations. What are you doing and why are you doing in that order? Specific examples to support assertions that you're making about rhetorical techniques that Harris is using. A fairly limited scope, only maybe one or two rhetorical elements that work really well. Not getting trapped in the meaning of the essay, but rather in the rhetorical effectiveness of this as well. A couple of things I would think about. One of them is, think about your introduction. You literally, kind of your first sentence is jumping right in. In Harris's, and I would also use his first name as well, the first time he introduction. In Sam Harris's Defense of Torture, he lays out the reason why torture is necessary in some cases. There's something before that. You need some type of introduction. Remember that an introduction is generally going to go from a very general idea to a very specific idea, generally terminating with your thesis as well. So a general idea might be something, and it may be something that's not necessarily about torture because that's his topic and not your topic. Your topic is rhetoric, so you may want to think about some way that you could talk about that and then use Harris as an example of it. So if you're talking about pathos or logos, which logo seems to be your big point, is that it might be is that possibly the only way to convince people that something they believe by their very kind of gut feelings is wrong is by the use of logic. You have to logically convince them. You have to use this deductive reasoning and comparisons to move them. So maybe that's the kind of general idea you start with in the introduction. And then you move into Harris as the example as well. One thing about your thesis as well, remember that we were talking about in the prompt, that it should somehow or another be talking about the effectiveness of Harris's article. So is it effective in persuading an audience or is it not? This is more of a statement. His main argument strategy is both deductive and comparisons to convince the reader of his points. I don't know if anybody would argue with that. That one's it's not as bad as other ones I've read, but that one, it's still, I would say he effectively, uses deductive and comparison to convince his audience, would kind of solve some of that problem right there. I think the big challenge that I had with your paper was kind of the organization of the body. You've got some really good points of analysis in here. I think specifically when you kind of move down into this part, when you're talking about the Dresden bombing strategy, even though dropping a bomb does a lot more damage than the shovel seems like a lot more of a horrible act. When reading this, the reader realizes that attacking women with a shovel seems much more brutal on the surface, but when thought through logically, they realize a bomb is much more destructive. That's great. His theory is that people are uncomfortable with attacks that happen when the attacker is up close to the victim. But so this is all good, and I think this is kind of a logical building of what he's trying to do as well. So one of the things that you might want to do is use that as kind of your strategy for analyzing the paper. So where else does he do that? Where else does he do the same type of kind of ratcheting up of, kind of logos as well? One of the things that I've suggested to a couple of people, and especially if you're kind of looking at logos as your main means of analyzing something, is you might want to do what is known as a reverse outline. So that's where you go and look at Harris's paper. I would look at each paragraph. I would then say, well, what is he doing in that paragraph? So I've got it right here in front of me. So his first paragraph talks about, the bomb in nearby city. Gives us this basic scenario, kind of identifies this as the ticking time bomb. Then in the second paragraph, he ratchets that up. If that doesn't seem to work, he ends up making a nuclear bomb. If that seems impersonal, he makes it a 7-year-old daughter. So also kind of personalizing and using pathos to do this as well. If your daughter doesn't tip the scales, then the daughters of every couple for 1,000 miles, millions of little girls. So again, lots of pathos driven here as well. Then kind of go through each one of those and talk about it, like, so what, how is he logically leading you to his point in the conclusion as well. And then provide little bits to support, such as your Dresden. I think that would end up being an effective way of doing this as well. I think the Gandhi one is also interesting as well. I don't know if he's discrediting Gandhi. I think what he's doing is he's setting up this scenario where he's saying the only way to so the argument, the counter argument that somebody would provide is that, well, okay, we'll just have to do in collateral damage. We'll have to just ensure that there would never be collateral damage. So that's what someone has argued. So Harris counter-argues with the fact that the only way to do that would be to refuse to fight. And then he kind of works through that systematically, kind of terminating in the idea of, well, Gandhi's solution to the Holocaust then would have been all the Jews needed to commit suicide to bring this to the attention of the world. And that's ridiculous. So it's not that he's discredited him. What he's doing, he's kind of working to a logical conclusion of this counter-argument as well, which I think also would serve you well. Think about your introduction. Think about your thesis. Think about reorganizing the body of the paper kind of with this idea of logic as being your main structure. Kind of, I think you've got some good examples. Now I think you need a larger superstructure to kind of contain these in. All right, I hope this was helpful.